Okay guys, we're going to be discussing question number 56 from section A, which will include the platysma, the sternocleidomastoid, and the cervical fascia. Okay, now quickly let's knock out the muscles. You have the platysma, okay, and the platysma is a subcutaneous muscle which will originate from the subcutaneous tissue of the infraclavicular and the supraclavicular regions, and will extend superiorly. Based on anatomical variation, it will go and insert into different places, but its most usual insertions are going to be the base of the mandible, the cheek, the skin of the lower lip, and etc. Okay? Now let's go to, by the way, this is page number 25 in the Netter's Atlas. Let's go to page 26 and look at the sternocleidomastoid muscle. The sternocleidomastoid muscle has two origins. It has a sternal head and a clavicular head. The sternal head will originate on the mediastinum sternum, and the clavicular head will originate on the clavicle. It's in the name, sternocleido, right? And then the two heads will join together and continue superiorly and posteriorly to the mastoid process and the superior nuchal line. Okay? Now, those are the two muscles. Now, if you guys will look in your locomotor themes book, which looks something like this, okay, we'll go to page 331 and look at a diagram of the cervical fascia. Now, the cervical fascia has three layers, okay, and it extends from the base of the mandible to the sternum and the clavicle, okay. The first layer you're going to have is going to be the superficial cervical fascia. Now, the superficial cervical fascia above the hyoid bone is going to fuse with the second layer, which is known as the pretracheal fascia, or pretracheal cervical fascia. Okay, so once again, the first layer of the cervical fascia is going to be your superficial cervical fascia, or your investing layer of the cervical fascia, and then the second layer is going to be your pretracheal cervical fascia. Now, the superficial cervical fascia, or the investing layer, is going to encompass all structures of the neck except the platysma muscle, because the platysma muscle is a subcutaneous muscle located in the subcutaneous layer, therefore more superficial to the cervical fascia. Okay. Now, if you look at the diagram below, okay, it will show you the structures. If you look at one, that's going to be your superficial cervical fascia, or your investing cervical fascia. That's going to exclude your platysma because of the reason I told before. It's a subcutaneous muscle, and it's going to enclose your sternocleidomastoid, and if you follow it, it's going to also enclose your trapezius, and the origin of the trapezius, it has three parts. It has a descending part, a transverse part, and an ascending part. The descending part originates from the external occipital protuberance and the highest nuchal line, and the transverse part originates from the levels of C7 to T3, and the ascending part originates from the levels of T2 to T12, and the trapezius, three parts, will insert onto three insertions. You have the spinal part, which will be the spine of the scapula. You have your acromial part, which will be the acromial end of the clavicle. And you'll have your, the clavicular part will be the acromial end of the clavicle, and the acromial part will be the acromion of the scapula. Okay? And the superficial cervical fascia will continue posteriorly as the nuchal fascia, and if you guys know, the nuchal fascia is a continuation of the thoracolumbar fascia from the posterior layer cranially. Okay, so the posterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia continuing superiorly is going to be your nuchal fascia. And once again, just the three insertions of the trapezius muscle. You're going to have your spine of the scapula, the acromion of the scapula, and the acromion of the clavicle. Okay, now let's follow the superficial cervical fascia back up, and you're going to have a gap between 1 and number 5, and that's going to be labeled as number 9. Number 9 is going to be a gap between your superficial cervical fascia and your pretracheal cervical fascia. That's going to be known as your suprasternal interfacial space, which is the gap between the two fascias. And then you have your pretracheal fascia. Now, the pretracheal fascia is most important for encompassing the infrahyoid musculature, and it's going to continue laterally. It's going to come in contact with your carotid sheath, and also is going to participate in forming the fascia of the carotid sheath. Now, the carotid sheath is a fascial covering of the neurovascular bundle, which includes the common carotid artery, and you know this is the internal jugular vein because of the larger lumen, and you have your vagus nerve passing, and I'm not sure, but I believe that the deep cervical ansa is in front of the vagus nerve. But if I'm incorrect, please don't be afraid to correct me in the comments. And if you see the pretracheal fascia, it's going to encompass the omohyoid, and at the lateral margin, it's going to continue as a thin sheet and then fuse with a third layer. And this layer is going to be the prevertebral layer, if you follow it back up. And if you see, the prevertebral layer is going to be separated by the pretracheal layer anteriorly by structures such as the neck and the larynx, which are not pictured here, but you have the thyroid gland, you have the trachea, and you have the esophagus, which separate the pretracheal layer from the prevertebral layer. And now, what the prevertebral layer encompasses is the vertebral column and the deep cervical muscles, also known as the prevertebral muscles. Okay? And that will cover question number 56 for section A.